Hello, and welcome to the Crystal Tablet podcast, a podcast where we talk about the intersections between politics and spirituality. I'm your host, Tola Brennan. This is also the first ever episode of Crystal Tablet. It is also my 31st birthday that I'm recording this, which is October 19th of the year 2021. So, in a way, this first episode is a little bit of a birthday present, in a way. I've been thinking about this podcast and wanting to start it for probably close to 2 years, and there's been some sort of nascent form of Crystal Tablet. It's had different names, it's had different presentations, and the intention has been loosely the same. I think there's a little bit of a development that has happened over the last 2 years that I would say that Crystal Tablet, being what this is and what it intends to become, is the byproduct of where I arrived as someone who has a view and experience of the world and has spent, I believe, a good amount of time, I would say at least 10 years, but depending on how ambitious I want to be about tracing some of the origins of my point of view into my past, I could say as much as, maybe even 20 years. I think that some of the things that are emerging here, they really do start very early on, and it's only recently that I can really kind of pinpoint that more fully, though it's been thought about on and off, being like, how did I get to be someone with this point of view? Anyway, enough about me. We're here to talk about the intersections of politics and spirituality. We're not here to talk about the biography of your podcast host, but podcasting is a medium that has been a part of my life for 10 years, and it really shapes who I am, and I have a lot of faith and love for the medium of podcasting. It feels very personal, and with some of my podcasts, my favorite podcasts that I listen to, there's a certain kind of intimacy and friendship that I feel. I really feel connected in a lot of ways to the people who create podcasts that I find the most transformative and moving, and there's something about feeling like someone. And so I think being personal and being who you are and being vulnerable and sensitive to what you're feeling, and there's an informality about podcasting that I don't want to lose. I think that I can also put on a more formal portrayal, and I think that we'll see what happens. I think that there's a little bit of both, and there's room for both. I do think, however, that a certain level of formal structure and having engaging guests is something that I think is really important. So a podcast is not a opportunity just to hang out, and so I think that in doing this initial episode where it is just me talking, I hope to make this be an exception. In general, I would like to have a lot of exciting conversations with people that hopefully will stimulate some really exciting possibilities in the world. And there's some ambition here. I think that what I'm getting at, I hope to persuade you, the listener, is something that I think is really critical. It's really important, and that is why I've been driven to start this podcast. And without further ado, I want to kind of get into the nitty-gritty and the meat of what is Crystal Tablet? Why would you want to listen to this podcast? What is it about? What are some of the things that you might take away? And also, what is the point of view? There is a point of view, and I want to just kind of be transparent about what that is, where I'm coming from, and I change as a person. Everyone changes, but some more than others, and I try to remain open to a shift in my worldview. But I also want to be clear that there's a thesis, there's a premise, there's a way of seeing things that is fundamental to what I'm getting on with here. So when I say Crystal Tablet is a podcast about the intersections of politics and spirituality, okay, well, let's just start there. What do we mean by that? With politics, for me, that means loosely just the way in which we structure the social order that we share. For me, that is inclusive of the more theoretical side of things, right? So a political ideology, And it's also inclusive of, the everyday policy choices that our electeds are making, supposedly representing us. And why is it that we have the system that we do? And how does it work, right? I think all that has to do with politics. And so politics is really a very broad and expansive category that, in a way, it can relate to practically every aspect of how we share space with each other. What does it mean to be in a society? Well, the answers and the questions both, to me, come from some form of politics. And so it's can be a lot of different things, but I think that's loosely how I think of it. A second point is that, of course, I have my own politics. I am a democratic socialist, and I think that, I'm not always a democratic socialist, strictly speaking. I think there's some other perspectives that I remain open to, and I don't want to. I don't want to be defined strictly by a label. But if I had to really summarize my perspective, I think democratic socialism is probably pretty close to my view of the world today and how we could improve it. And I think that is something that brings up something that is important about politics, is that that kind of idea of how things could be better, right? I think that there's an inspirational, aspirational angle to politics, which I think that is part of the reason why I'm drawn to something like democratic socialism. And while we're at it, if I was going to define what socialism means to me, in a nutshell, I would say that it's simply a society that cares about people, right? How could we have a society, a social order, that genuinely attempts to care about people? And I think that the simplest ways in which that can be defined or represented and justified as a this is actually what we're doing and working is addressing some really fundamental issues, and that is healthcare, of course, housing, wages, job security. It is education. It's a lot of the basic things that if they're not there, it's very difficult to live a life that is not extremely strained and difficult. And so access to drinking water and sanitation, and what is the infrastructure that is available, and how is that put together, and what are the costs, who can afford it, right? All those kinds of things I think are very fundamental to both why it is that someone who wants to make the world a better place would be involved in politics. To me, at least, that is where I go with it. And to me, socialism is the obvious answer to that. I think that there might be other answers, but it feels the most practical. It feels the most achievable, and it's something that I could see happening in our lifetimes actually pretty quickly, if there was a political will to make it possible. And I think that it's not necessarily the perfect system. I think there's some issues that I have, especially in terms of things moving in a direction that feels a bit more authoritarian. And I think that there are some challenges, especially around things like the Green New Deal and how that might be implemented, where, I don't know, there are some challenging questions around personal freedoms compared with, survival and well-being of the collective. And I think that there are moments where it is not, it's not straightforward, it's not obvious, and I find myself conflicted. However, I don't really want to spend too long on this. I think that it'll come up thematically on and off. So that's politics, right? Sure. I'm sure that I could say a lot more about what politics is to me and how it relates to this particular series of conversations. But just keeping things right to the point, that's politics, right? When I say spirituality, let's define that a little bit. What do we mean by spirituality? So the way I think of it, and there are a few scholars of spirituality who I think have said something very similar. I can't recall. Mitch Horowitz, who's somewhat well known in this field, in this conversation, has a book called Occult America, and it goes into the history of spirituality in the United States in a good amount of detail. I was also reading a book around the same time that also talked about the history of spirituality in the United States in particular, So I might be blurring some of the details here, but this is my own point of view, but it's sort of a paraphrase of some of the writing that has been done, kind of looking at this history. And while spirituality has a significant number of sometimes not overlapping meanings, and it means something very different to different people, and it is also a word that can be very personal, right? It is a representation of things that sometimes touch the deepest parts of who we are. So, of course, it means a lot of things, but just for the purposes of starting somewhere that is, not a bad jumping off point, this is a definition that I'm about to give that I actually personally kind of, I like for a number of reasons, and I think that it makes sense. So spirituality, in my view, at least paraphrasing a little bit some of the sources that I mentioned and others, is largely everything that doesn't fit into these two kind of poles that orient a lot of the world. And one of those, as you can probably guess, is religion, monotheistic religion in particular. And let's just say, to be clear, we're talking about, conventional religion. And that is meant, by that is meant, some kind of a clergy, a priesthood, and then people who look to those leaders to be the intermediaries between themselves and the divine, right? So in a conventional religious setting, in large part, you turn to a priest of some kind who's your sort of interpreter for God, who is represented in, of course, some ways that can be can feel a little bit constrained. So conventional religion, right? That's, I think, if you look at the numbers of just, people who are alive today, I think we still live in a world that has far more religious believers than, the population of the secular world, right? So even today, in a time that can feel very secular, just based on the numbers, I'm pretty sure we have a lot more people who are, devoted to whatever their religion is. Of course, a lot of times this can be so intertwined with what we often describe as culture that it might be difficult to really kind of be really clear about, what do we mean by that, if there's some kind of a slicing and dicing of the numbers. But so religion, right, that occupies and drives forwards and defines the worldview and the life experience of many, many people. And then the other one that I think also you can probably guess is sort of science in the secular world. And it's a world that, of course, emerges in Europe about 400 or 500 years ago and is defined by more and more a separation away from sort of the religious past and an embrace of the world that is defined by technology and industry. And increasingly, science is the sort of primary sort of interpretive framework that gives meaning and organizes the way that we interpret the reality around us. Generally speaking, we can describe this scientific viewpoint as materialism. There are definitely some distinctions and there's some deviation, but in large part, the scientific worldview is a materialistic worldview, which we'll come back to what that word means and what is the context and how is that deployed, because it can be used in all kinds of debates, which this podcast is sure to become embroiled in at least some of at some point. So the scientific secular world and the religious world are these two sort of formative social forces that I would say are the two big drivers and the pillars of the world that we live in today, right? In some way or other, the worldview of most people, I would say, is shaped pretty heavily by one of those two contexts, right? Either you grew up with religion or you didn't. And so there's, the atheist or the agnostic position, and then there's being involved in various kinds of religious practices, whether that means you go to a church or a synagogue or a mosque or something else. That is that's who you are. That's a big part of your worldview and your belief, right? So those two things exist, and spirituality, in a lot of ways, I think is just everything that doesn't fit into those two categories, right? It's beliefs and its practices. And it's people who neither want to be part of institutionalized religion and also are unsatisfied or reject, for any number of reasons, sort of an atheistic or an agnostic framework. Now, this is not to say that you can't be functionally atheist and still very spiritual. I don't want to exclude people who might very well relate to the word spirituality. And I think that one of the things that defines spirituality also is that it's self-directed. People who define themselves as spiritual, I think, more often than not, have gone on some kind of personal journey to arrive at the view that they arrive at and that they think of as spiritual. So I think that's something that we can say is pretty common and a big part of what makes spirituality be what it is. But even before we get to that sort of self-defining characteristic and why that is, I think the important thing is that it sort of is in this middle ground, right? It's between and it's neither, and it has elements of both. But really, it's just a lot of things that don't quite fit into the institutional context of the academy and the scientific and educational institutions. And it also doesn't fit into the institutions of religion either. Now, one important caveat here, of course, is that, especially in the East, right, a lot of the things that we think of as spirituality have their origins in Buddhism and Hinduism. And so, especially as it relates to sort of these things that we call Hinduism, of course, Hinduism is a set of isms. It's not a singular ism. But that's something that I, not being a fully qualified religious scholar, sort of want to hold off on saying too many things about, lest I say things that are inaccurate. But just from a rudimentary understanding, my understanding is that it's a collection of practices. It's not a monolith. So especially there, of course, some of the things that we think of as spirituality or relating to spirituality, yoga, for example, obviously could be thought of as in some ways part of a religion, right? So with any of these categories and definitions, there are going to be many exceptions. I don't think that there's any kind of all-inclusive category that just does the work and is neat, right? It's all kind of messy, and it's all trying to find a way to simplify some genuinely very deeply complicated and confusing issues. So, of course, there are going to be some challenges to finding neat definitions, but I'm making an effort here, an attempt just to kind of get some foundational things out of the way. And I think there's two different approaches. One, how is spirituality not religion, right? And then how is spirituality not part of sort of the contemporary secular world? Now, the distinction between spirituality and religion, I think, has to do with, as I mentioned before, the intermediaries, right? That's one part of it. But it's also important to note that especially in the monotheistic religions, there is a place for more immediate apprehension or participation or connection to the divine. And so that is typically referred to as mysticism. And so that would be Sufism in Islam, and there's a sort of Christian mysticism, and there's Kabbalah. And so inside of the monotheistic religions, there has been a place for people to more directly relate to the divine. I think that spirituality can often approach the same sets of priorities and desires, right, to get some kind of real feedback, what from asking the bigger questions of life, right, like why am I here? What is there a life after death? Or what really is the universe? Where did it come from? Right, these are questions that, of course, are typically addressed by philosophy. Now, at first, philosophy was something that I was persuaded to really look at seriously, and I did. And there are some very specific reasons why I ultimately decided that philosophy is foundationally and fundamentally insufficient, and really just based on the way that it currently operates is never going to give any kind of a meaningful answer to any of these questions. And in fact, it is sort of necessary to leave behind a lot of the sort of contemporary philosophical thinking. Of course, someone's going to disagree with me by making that point, and that's okay. I am here for disagreements. I just know that in my own life, it's not to say that I didn't first look at philosophy. I had a period in high school where I was sort of existential. I've gone through other phases, and there are definitely some points of view and some ideas that come from philosophy that I think can be really interesting. There's this is much later in life, but there's a book by Michel Foucault, who's, kind of a fancy philosopher who writes these thick books and, is kind of a hip name to drop, I suppose. I haven't really been in a place where dropping Foucault would be hip, but, trying to give some kind of context for Foucault, I guess, for I don't know, people who may have not heard of the name or whatever. And if you have heard of Foucault, then maybe you're snickering or laughing at me or thinking I got it totally wrong, or maybe I hit it on the nail. Anyway, Foucault has a book that I read a number of years ago. Of course, it was assigned to me. I didn't independently pick it up. It was his first published book, and it was deeply, deeply formative. And I think that it's still one of his most interesting pieces of writing. I haven't finished another Foucault book because they're quite long, but so of course, the fact that I think of myself primarily as someone who works and thinks in the context of metaphysics, which I'll come back to and define a bit more and clarify what is meant by that. It's not that I didn't have a period of being persuaded and interested in philosophy. It stopped doing much for me, and eventually I moved on. And I think that I wish more people could make that jump. And I do think that it genuinely is a progression. And at some point, I think that I will, maybe not in this episode, at some point, I think I can give a pretty clear reason, or a set of reasons, even better, a persuasive argument for why that is the case, and maybe encourage some people to take that little leap, go beyond philosophy, think about the world in a little bit of a different way. Anyway, I got totally caught on this little tangent here. I get caught into tangents pretty often, so I'm sure we'll see it happen again. But coming right on to the track, getting right back to that core point. In conventional monotheistic religions, there is a place for mystical experience, which you can find a lot of writing about. And there's sort of a unitive or an ecstatic state. There's in Sufism, the divine is referred to as the beloved. If you've heard of the poetry of Rumi, right, that is often addressed to the beloved. And so, there's a very visceral, emotional, deep, profound connection that mystics have with what we would call the divine or God or oneness. I think that while that is the case, I think there's a little bit more of a wanting to know, and there's a little bit more of a wanting to kind of forge your own path that I think is part of what makes spirituality be spirituality. And so, within the conventional religious framework, right, there is this sort of mystical path. And I think the mysticism of monotheism absolutely does play a role in shaping and forming and influencing spirituality. And they're not separate things. But I think spirituality has its own sort of way of approaching things, and it's pretty different, right? I think that as a resident of the everyday modern world, we're simply not mystics. I mean, I guess some people can be, and some people try to be, but if you're living an everyday life inside of Western capitalism, you're probably not a mystic, and you might be most of the way there. But it's a bit hard to juggle both, right? So there's a certain kind of having to get by with a slightly different set of challenges and opportunities. Anyway, I hope that kind of clarifies a little bit how spirituality is overlaps with religion, but it really is, it's different. And I hope that the differences will become more and more apparent, and hopefully we'll get a little bit closer to something that feels like a tangible definition of spirituality, and then we'll go from there. So spirituality and the sort of secular world, right? Where are the separations? Why are they different things? One of the examples that I like to use is the novel Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, right? A lot of us have read Frankenstein, and I reread it not so long ago, a few years ago, and I was really blown away because it really just gets right at this separation, and it's very fascinating. If you read the beginning of Frankenstein with this particular set of ideas in mind, I think it becomes really apparent, and it was a profound shift. It totally was not apparent to me when I first read the book when I was in high school, whenever that was. And so the reason why Frankenstein is such a wonderful example is it really illustrates this sort of the world before and the world after. And so in the beginning of Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, he's talking about living in this world that is defined by the steam engine and by technology. And there's this whole, science is going to finally answer all the questions that we've been wondering about. And in the sort of past, in that past world, there's this world of superstition and of alchemy, of the time that came before, right? And in Frankenstein, you really vividly get the sense of these two worlds and how this sort of new sort of scientific glistening sort of, we're going to figure it all out and we're most of the way there, this kind of the sense of acquiring this deep and fundamental knowledge and also power over the universe, right? I think these two things are connected. And in industrial capitalism and science, I think have a lot of, commonalities in a lot of ways. And I think we'll kind of get there and, sort of give you a hint of where I stand with some of these things. In any case, Frankenstein, part of where he sort of derives the capacity to reanimate a corpse, right, to do this thing that is sort of very weird and magical. It's reaching into this alchemical past. And I think that, it's particularly in the beginning of the book, you get a sense of these two different worlds. And I think that's the thing that I really think is amazing about it. It is an example. I don't know if I'm doing the best job of communicating the palpability of that, but if you read especially the first 40 or 50 pages, you really kind of get this sense of that was when it happened, right? That's when it was like in living memory, right? In our living memory, we're like, oh yeah, remember when people had like telephones, right? Depending on what age you are, right? There's the before and after with cell phones, right? There's landlines, and now there's iPhones and Androids, right? Frankenstein is written in a little bit of a similar kind of context where it just feels like from the writing, there's like this before, right? Back before this kind of advent of this sort of scientific revolution and this industrial revolution. And then there's like, they're in the midst of it. It's just beginning, right? And there's really a sense of transformation in the collective psyche. And I think that, that's one example. And then another example that will come up very often in terms of where is there a fork is it's kind of that point where, at one point, astrology and astronomy were the same thing. And at a certain point, they're not. And, I don't want to go too deep into this particular example because it gets kind of thorny. And I'd have to make citations and references to things that, frankly, I've not read or read fully. And it's been a long time since I've really kind of gone down this deep dive of the sort of separations between, the emerging scientific viewpoint and how that has gradually let go of, released, and ultimately suppressed some of the spiritual and religious kinds of inspirations and influences. And to get to, I think by around 1900, we have a pretty clear distinction of sort of the roles in which these different forces play. So spirituality has, of course, played a pretty significant role in U.S. history, and I won't go into that, but there are some books, Occult America being one, that will kind of open up some of those examples from long ago that are pretty interesting. It's also a kind of a niche interest, I suppose, so I don't want to go and get too caught up in giving those examples, but I will say that in particular, the sort of spiritualist movement for me was incredibly fascinating and really answered just so many questions that I had about spirituality and how it exists in the world today, and how did we get there? And I think that the late 19th century, it really, just personally, it answered a lot of questions, and it was a lot of aha moments of like, oh, I understand now why this is how we talk about these things. Why is it that we have these kinds of existing mindsets and sort of default or reactionary kinds of responses to certain kinds of phenomenon? A lot of that has to do with, paranormal sort of phenomenon and ghosts and what have you. But I think that there's a commonality of response across a lot of things that sort of don't fit in. And spirituality is not the same as sort of paranormal phenomenon, but there's a connection there, and there's some overlap. So I want to kind of treat these things separately because they deserve a certain level of separation, because they're not all the same thing, but ultimately the connections are probably more significant than the differences. But just for now, for the sake of definition, let's just put this aside. Anyway, so I think that in very loosely kind of suggests, some of the things that maybe are already familiar, but, spirituality in some ways derives from and draws upon that sort of alchemical past, and we can get deeper into things like the perennial philosophy, which is a term that some people may be familiar with. We could also talk about sort of the broader strokes history of Western occultism, which also plays a pretty big role. So, there's a lot of different threads that we can kind of tease apart. We can also talk about, I think, another thing that I think is very interesting is just, when I first learned about this, it was another kind of a very exciting moment when I started to understand that Christianity is not monolithic. I didn't grow up with Christianity in my life, and I have kind of, got to learn a little bit about it from the outside. And when I kind of understood that Christianity is not monolithic and has this really interesting history that many people don't know about, and then actually there's a time before Christianity really was codified, and at the beginning of Christianity, there were a lot of competing sects, and the Gnostic sect in particular has had a sort of resurgence of interest recently, but they're heretics, right? And there is a lot of oppression and tamping down on a variety of different Christianities until we finally get to this one Christianity that's the only one and can be used as a basis for some pretty atrocious historical phenomenon, without getting into the weeds of what we're talking about, which is colonialism, and other things. But just starting there, that already gives you a good amount to look at as far as doing really cruel things to other human beings. Anyway, not to get too caught up on that one in particular, I think that coming back to the main thread, I think that one thing that we can kind of, teasing things up into the present day pretty quickly, just to not get too much in these long historical detours. I think context is important, but getting too far into the context, and it starts to become a little bit of a special interest kind of thing. And I want to keep it engaging for whoever it is who might be listening to this first episode of the podcast. Okay, so getting really, really quickly caught up. The last thing that I mentioned that I think gives us a little bit of a historical anchor is spiritualism, which was a movement that really took root. And, spirituality and spiritualism, not the same thing. Spiritualism is a specific movement that really had a lot to do with speaking to the dead using seances. And there's a lot more that can be said about spiritualism, but it was extremely popular. And many people at a certain point, let's say like 1880, for example, I think something like 1 in 10 Americans were spiritualists. So it kind of it's one of those things that was massively popular. A lot of people were spiritualists. A lot of seances were happening all over the country. A lot of people were deeply fascinated by the prospect of speaking to a deceased relative through some form of mediumship. And then for a number of reasons, it kind of collapsed and the movement sort of fizzled out. And it was replaced and succeeded by Theosophy. The founders of the Theosophical movement actually met at a spiritualist seance, I believe in 1870. And Theosophy sort of, to me, laid the groundwork for a lot of the spirituality that we take for granted these days. And I think that there's a lot of debt that if you're someone who's inspired by any part of spirituality, I think we owe a lot to the early Theosophists, especially when they were starting out what they were doing. And I recently became a member of the Theosophical Society of America. And there are a number of reasons for that. I'm still ambivalent about the extent to which I might be persuaded to become more involved or feel like I want to run towards being part of an organization. I think that an organization in general, it's I want to feel comfortable before I get too involved. But, I kind of felt like it was a way to solidify my belief that Theosophy still is probably the last time that there's been a really coherent attempt to sort of do a bit more of an institutionalized approach of looking at some of these kinds of interesting phenomenon and questions that come up in the course of going on a spiritual journey. And I think there really hasn't been a whole lot. And I think that it's a real tragedy that there hasn't really been a successor. And I also think that what the Theosophists were doing around the turn of the century really set a pretty high bar. And because our society and our culture has moved in such a materialistic direction, and because there's such a rejection of many things that are defining of spirituality in the context of the academy, and because there's not really a lot of space given to a lot of these things in sort of conventional religion, there really hasn't been, there's really nothing else, right? There's not really a lot of other existing contexts where there could be a coherent group of people who are really very serious about exploring some of these kinds of spiritual questions. Now, it wouldn't be right not to mention that, of course, succeeding Theosophy, Rudolf Steiner, and Anthroposophy certainly took up a lot of those same aspirations. I think that I also find Rudolf Steiner inspiring and interesting in certain ways. I also have some challenges with some of the things that he writes about, and some parts of his worldview I struggle with. So I think that for me, Theosophy, also because Theosophy, I believe, just led to a lot more developments in the emergence of a spiritual culture in the United States and in the Western world in general. I think that Theosophy still is like, it's very formative. And I think that another kind of period that will come up often is what's called the Occult revival, which is, when tarot cards kind of became very popular, the sort of the formations of neo-paganism and witchcraft in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. There's a whole wave of a rediscovery of some of these things that maybe are more associated with like a pagan past, right? It's just one example. There's also the age of Aquarius, and there's the hippie generation, and there's the psychedelic movement. And I think all these things do play a role. And I think that when we're talking about spirituality today, some or all of those things probably have some role to play in at least shaping, if not maybe being an active part of the people who would define themselves as spiritual. So when I'm saying spiritual and spirituality, I think it's inclusive of all those things, but there's the way to think about spirituality in terms of who would take on that label. There's also the things we can think about in terms of what defines spirituality. So, for example, someone who's deeply invested in astrology, as an example, or someone who's invested in Reiki, for example. These are things that we would probably associate with spirituality. Of course, meditation, or having a lot of crystals, or I think there's a pretty obvious sort of things that would come up in terms of when we think about spirituality. What would that be inclusive of? So that's one part of it. And I think that all of those things are things that I anticipate and want to have this podcast spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about. And I would love to speak to people who can have a really exciting and engaging conversation to cover all of that ground, because I think it's all interconnected. But this podcast is about the intersections between spirituality and politics. So I don't want to get too far off the mark here. I want to kind of give some clear background and context for at least how I approach this particular topic and where I'm coming from, and a little bit of what my perspective and inspirations and influences might be as it relates to looking at this topic. But I don't want to get too far away into these far corners too early on. I want to talk about the intersections and get kind of right at the meat of what this podcast is really about. But I want to take one more little detour before we get there. And to me, that detour is kind of important because while we can talk about spirituality in terms of practices and what people might do, spirituality, in my view, is sort of a way to get at some pretty fundamental questions about what this reality is. For me, metaphysics is a bit more of a codified way of approaching some of these kinds of existential or philosophical questions. Spirituality, I think, is a bit more nebulous and a bit more oriented around things that you might do, right? So meditation, for example. Whereas metaphysics is really getting into the nitty-gritty and a bit more of a it's not like science in a lot of ways, but there's a certain level of detail and scrutiny and wanting to come to things that can be defined, right? And that's sort of a characteristic of a lot of Western occultism and and part of the reason why, a lot of it is, for me, very influential. Other parts of it, not so much. And they're the sort of the things that I take and the things that I think are really useful and valuable for me. And there's the other parts that I'm not as persuaded by. So I think I've been, kind of bouncing back and forth a little bit between the politics and the spirituality. And I really want to kind of get to the real driving force about this podcast. Why this podcast? Why make this podcast? And what do I mean when I talk about the intersections between politics and spirituality? I think I've spent a lot of time talking about spirituality for the most part, not as much about leftist politics. And I think there's a lot to say there. But I think that, I think it's pretty apparent that my grounding is more comprehensively in sort of spirituality and the history of spirituality. And my participation in politics is not as active, and I wish that I could be more present. With some of those kinds of dilemmas in mind, I've been very hesitant to start this podcast. I've been asking myself, what makes me qualified? Why should I be putting myself out there, my voice? Have I done enough work to arrive at a point of view that is really worth sharing? And I think that I have, but really just arriving there. So if you're listening to this in the future, please bear with me. I'm just starting out. I'm really trying to find a way to express a pretty complicated set of ideas, how they relate to each other, and try not to alienate too many people, and alienate the people that I do want to alienate, because there's some people that I really I find very disagreeable. I think that I have some arguments that I would bring forwards, and some people that I would like to debate, and express to them why I believe that their perspectives are incorrect, or wrong, or wrong-headed, or misguided, right? So there's a bit of both of trying to kind of find my way in what can be a very antagonizing and antagonistic, polarized world of viewpoints that are incompatible. And I'm definitely entering into the fray here a little bit because I have reasons to be sort of a little bit pushing at some things, both with people who are spiritual and people who are political. And I think that there's a looking to find the unity, but there's also a lot of things that I find kind of troubling. So let me just kind of bounce back and forth a little bit, because I think that when I'm talking about intersections, this is really kind of getting into the intersection part. Like, where are the overlaps, or where are there not overlaps? And so when I think about my looking at sort of leftist politics more generally, and I think that is inclusive of socialism and also other kind of tendencies and threads like anarchism, and other isms. I guess there's some communists out there and what have you. But I think that there's different parts of the sort of leftist project, and in general, I think there's just a real dismissal and a shutting down of conversations that become too spiritual. And I think that's really, as I said before, I think it's really unfortunate, and I think that there's some really good arguments for why that should change. But I don't really want to get too deep in them right now, just because it's sort of teasing out the aspirations and the goal. I don't really want to really kind of be rhetorically precise at this point, because I think there's time. There's time to get more specific. I think if I had to kind of summarize, though, because I don't want to just sort of say that and not fill it in with anything. If I could summarize, I would say that my personal take on this, my perspective, is that we do in fact live in a world that is very spiritual, and it is very much a creation of sort of metaphysical ideas, at least the way that I see it. And I think that embracing that, I think, is an incredibly powerful tool to help bring about, I think, a better world. And I believe that in its best moments, that is really what sort of a leftist project is about. We should live in a world where everyday people are cared about. We should live in a world where people are not shackled to their employment. We should live in a world where capitalism doesn't exploit people in the way that it does today. We should live in a world that is a bit more equal, or a little bit more just, or more fair, or maybe just let's tackle climate change, and figure out which one can happen first. And of course, there's different views there, right? So I think that there's a fundamentally good and loving and caring ethos, I believe, that is what would make you want to be a leftist in the first place. There's also clearly a lot besides, a lot of animosity. But I think that, fundamentally focusing on what is persuasive about a leftist politics, I think that it comes down to, we want to live in a better, a kinder, more caring world. And I think that recognizing and embracing some of the perspectives and some of the ideas that come from spirituality, to me, not only are an accurate representation of the world that we live in, and of course I'll back that up and justify it as we go along here. I think that not only is that the case, but also there are a lot of potentials for genuine transformation and growth that come from embracing this. And I don't think that there's really anything to lose, and I think there's a lot to gain. And a lot of that thing, the thing that would be gained, is really just keeping it just couched in some really kind of conventional language. It's imagination, right? I think that really being able to imagine what's possible. Some of that comes from spirituality in different ways, whether it's dreams or visions or simply being visionary in the first place, really imagining something different for the future. I think there's a real an unlocking and a transformation and a capacity to see differently that to me is deeply stimulated and often defined by spirituality. So I'll get more into what I mean by that, but I just wanted to kind of say that it's really a shift in consciousness and a change in how you might approach things that I think is made possible by these tools, techniques, ways of being, perspective, etc. And I think it has a lot to contribute to sort of the project of making a society that works for everyone. And I think that is that's when I think of socialism, that's really what I keep coming back to, trying to make a society that works for everyone and really, hashing that out in a real way, that it's not sort of so sophistic or whatever. It's really genuine. Like, how do we do that, really? So by the same token, I think in spirituality, I think there's a pretty, and I think that it's driven by capitalism. It's derived from capitalism. It's sort of forced upon people because of capitalism. But there's a pretty clear kind of embrace of, sort of the hustle. And, a lot of spirituality can justifiably feel very exploitative and predatory. And I think there's a lot of selling things, right? And of course, you're selling things because you want to survive. And in some instances, you even want to do more than that. You want to be wealthy yourself. And so I think that there's plenty to say negatively about things like, for example, The Secret, or what is conventionally called the prosperity gospel. And I think the place where I kind of fall away from a lot of the critics is that I personally believe in the sort of what we call the law of attraction. I just think that the way that you interpret that and what you do with it, that does make a difference, right? So the sort of a prosperity gospel, which says that you can be rich like the billionaires, right? I mean, I think that's as a socialist, there's some pretty obvious reasons why that is a sort of an odious goal. And from that, one response just is to say, this whole thing is preposterous, and why would you even think to believe that you live in a universe that would be so responsive to such shallow or selfish aspirations. And I think that I can understand on a superficial level why that might be a response, but I think that it's not true. I think it's wrong. I think that we live in a universe that actually is very responsive to our consciousness, and I think that while it doesn't quite hit the mark for me, something very similar to what we call the law of attraction, I do think is something that I notice in my life and is something that I've seen written about and I've heard many people talk about in podcasts and reading books and in talking to people about their own personal lives beyond just experiencing this very directly in many ways. I do think that the universe is alive and aware, and consciousness is fundamental and everywhere, right? And so with that in mind, the idea that the universe would be responsive is sort of self-evident, right? I mean, of course it would be. Why wouldn't it? So I think that that pretty much does it. I think that I sort of feel like I've laid out the sort of basic ideas. I want to kind of wrap up, though, with really kind of getting at, okay, so I've talked about spirituality, I've talked about politics, I've talked about different kinds of threads, I've talked about how spirituality is different than, sort of conventional sort of reality-defining systems of thought that we probably are familiar with or grew up around in some form. But really, what's the deal with this intersection thing, really, right? I think that there's, and I think that's something that I'm also, I'm trying to answer that question for myself. What does it mean? Because I know that I have some things that I'd like to express and converse about with people who identify or are more active in sort of everyday political struggles. And there's also some things that I want to ask and converse with people who are more involved in sort of the spiritual world. I also can't close this episode without mentioning Marianne Williamson, right? Someone who I really do look up to. I think that I'm not Christian, and so for me that can be a little bit of a barrier because she is Christian. But I think that her values and her principles are very compelling. I've met her in person, and I think she's a really wonderful presence. And I don't know that she really had a shot at the presidential run, but I think that she brought some really wonderful ideas and took a lot of hits. In many cases, I think really unfairly, and I think she was sort of tarnished by a lot of people and not really given a chance. But when I saw her at the podium when she was still in the debates, I think she really had some extremely strong points, and I think that I've not read a huge amount of her books, but I have a few that I'm working through, and I think she really encapsulates a very sort of a universalist perspective on some of these kinds of themes, and is absolutely in the realm between politics and spirituality, and so is someone I look to as inspiration. I don't think that we share everything in common, but I think that she's really doing something in a way that I really respect, and so I just wanted to kind of mention that. When we're talking about politics and spirituality, Marianne Williamson is probably one of the few people out there who I think really is very active in both those categories, and continues to do that and to really speak up for a lot of things that I believe in. I also want to mention my favorite podcast, my inspiration, Against Everyone with Conor Habib. A lot of the reason why I'm making this podcast is in part because over the last few years, this podcast in particular has been a really big part of my life. And so, Conor, if you ever listen to this episode, thank you so much. This podcast exists in so many ways because of your voice, and I just wanted to kind of put that out there in the end. And Conor, if you haven't had a chance to listen to his podcast, is a really wonderful podcaster, and I haven't met him in person, but appears to be a really wonderful person as well. He's really been looking at politics and spirituality and going back and forth in a way that I think really not a lot of people do. And so I found my way to, these two worlds long before I found other people who were really doing that work. And so as I've kind of looked around and tried to find people who see politics and spirituality as being inextricably linked, the people that do show up who really are doing that work of connecting, I find really really persuasive. Of course, I just want to kind of reiterate that again, a lot of Native people who are active, like Winona LaDuke, for example, a lot of people who are doing that kind of work, there is a spirituality already there, and so I don't want to kind of I don't want to gloss over things as if I'm not aware of them. I just think there's sort of a particular focus here that I'm working on figuring out. Anyway. Thank you for listening this far. I hope I was not too long-winded or boring, or I guess if you thought I was boring, you wouldn't be hearing me say this at all. So, hopefully there's something of value, and I really hope to continue this, to keep going, and to of course get more concise, more exciting, and really hear from anyone who's listening. I'm doing this for you, whoever is out there who is hearing my voice right now. Look, I can hear myself talk. I can rant to the people that I have in my personal life. There's many conversations around these subjects that I've already had, and that's not why I'm doing this here. I'm doing this because I really want to engage with people out in the world, and really, so any kind of genuine feedback about any of this, I think it's really important to me, and that's really what it's about. It's about being in dialogue. That being said, I'm kind of, got my foot in the sand with certain things. There's some things that I'm ready to argue about, and I'm ready to argue, so I'm happy, and I embrace that. I recognize that where I'm coming from is atypical in a lot of ways, And it, in my view, should not be atypical, but it would be kind of absurd to think otherwise. So I'm really receptive. I really want to hear what anyone thinks about what I have to say, and it helps me be more clear about why it is that I represent what I do, why I say what I do, and why I look to what I look to as sources of inspiration, and to answer these kinds of proverbial questions, which feel particularly significant given that we are living through some catalytic times full of upheaval. I think there is room to answer the same questions in new ways, and I think that the pathway that I'm describing here is can go a long ways to getting there. But there's a little bit of faith, and it may not be for everyone, but if you're willing to take a journey, I think that there's a journey here. So it is getting on in the length, and so I'm gonna probably end it here. And until next time. Okay, thanks for listening.